All right, for part 2 of Unit 2, we're going to discuss industrialism and labor unions. So we'll talk about, like I said, this is the Gilded Age that we're discussing, and this was the period after Reconstruction. It lasted from the 1860s till 1896. It continued with industrialization of these northern cities and factories. It promoted economic growth. It also promoted urbanization because you just saw in the last section that many immigrants came to the United States because they were looking for work. As a result, labor unions began to form because these unions, would try to protect the workers or try to push for better wages, better treatment, and things like that. The railroad industry. So the need increased and also operating cost increased. Why do we need railroads? If you think about why we need railroads, it's because railroads, you're able to fit a lot of stuff in the train cars, and you were able to now ship that stuff across the country. And so what that did is it benefited trade, and it also increased business. So capital investment from government and private businesses happened. Okay, so that means they invested into the railroads. They gave loans and land grants to help build the railroad. They received almost 200 million acres of public land from the government, and in May 10th, 1869, the Transcontinental Railroad was completed, the first railroad that connected the East and the West Coast. So this was huge for trade in the United States. This is a map, okay, the railroad industry, 1861, 1876, all right, 1893. Now the influence of the railroad. Increased demand for coal, iron, steel, lumber, and glass. These industries saw an increase in profits. Small towns grew, and they were no longer isolated. Cities began to specialize in specific goods. For example, Birmingham, Alabama was originally created because of the ability for them to create steel. Okay, so if you've ever gone to downtown Birmingham and you see the steel mills, Sloss Furnace is no longer in operation. The mill in Fairfield closed down for a little while, but I think it had gotten reopened. Okay, so that is kind of how Birmingham got its start, through steel. Business profits also increased because they could sell their goods now in towns that were far away. New towns popped up along railroad tracks. So in Birmingham, for example, when you go through, you've got a very large group of railroad tracks that run directly through the middle of the city, and it separates the south side from the north side. Sorry, I'm having a blank here. All right, railroad influence. People traveled by railroad. It became a lot safer with the creation of the air brake, and it became more comfortable through the creation of the Pullman sleeping car. And this is a picture of it below. And that means that now people were able to sleep so they could take overnight trips. It was kind of like they had little like bunk beds or little room areas in here for people to lay. Another thing that happened was they created time zones. Time zones were used to determine time, or the sun was originally. When the sun was directly overhead, that's where we get noon. Cities near each other had different times, so travelers would have to reset watches by minutes to be on local time. So what happened in 1869, Professor C.F. Dowd proposed 24 time zones, one zone for each hour. And this is the map below, okay? So we are on Central Standard Time, and then obviously you've got Eastern Standard Time, okay? The U.S. would have 4, there we go, Eastern, Central, Mountain, and Pacific. And these are more pictures. So again, Alabama right here is Central, this is Mountain Time, and this is Pacific Standard, and then you've got Eastern Standard. Railroad workers. So the people who built the railroads, they faced a lot of extreme hardships. It was very dangerous. Many of the people who worked on the railroads were minorities, and they were paid much less than white workers. White workers were paid for a 10-hour workday $60 a month, and they got food. The Chinese, however, the immigrants from China, they worked sun up to sundown for $35, and they got no food. You also had accidents, diseases, and the Native American tribes who were still living in these areas would sometimes attack the railroad workers, and they would get killed. So this is a picture of Chinese railroad workers in the snow in 1865. So natural resources. These are things that are that will eventually run out, but natural resources are things that are found from the earth. So oil is very in high demand. Okay, you need oil for a lot of things. Usually, if something happens, for example, like when we had the hurricanes that hit Texas, off the coast of Texas, there were oil rigs out in the ocean, and when the hurricane hit, those oil rigs got damaged, and the prices of gasoline went up. So that just shows you how oil is used. So you have kerosene and petroleum. Petroleum is another word for gas. Kerosene can be distilled from coal. Kerosene is also used as fuel to light lamps. In 1859, petroleum was drilled with steam engine in Pennsylvania. Petroleum also became the main source of kerosene. If you look at the bottom picture to the left, that shows oil or petroleum spewing out of the Lady Hunter well in Pennsylvania in 1880. And let me just tell you, the people who owned this land that found this oil, they became rich, okay? The oil boom spread, and then they started to create distilleries to help break apart that oil and use it and make it into different things, different products. So for example, petroleum would make kerosene, paraffin, petroleum jelly, gasoline, and even asphalt. Now, unfortunately, you've got environmental effects. So when you drill for petroleum and iron, it destroys the land. Factory smokestacks release pollutants into the air, rivers, and lakes. So here you see a picture of pollution coming out of a steel factory smokestacks in 1909. Birmingham, Alabama, when they started producing steel, it would look like this. It was that smoky and foggy and just mucky, okay? And then there's this picture. It says wire mills in Pennsylvania spewing smoke near a river. All right? So the issue was farmers. In 1867, Grange was founded. This was an organization that demanded government control of the railroad industry because they believed that the railroad was corrupted. That's what, if you look at this picture over here, again, this is Uncle Sam, who is kind of like the mascot for the United States. And you see this big businessman over here, and it says operating expenses. And these are some other things. And he is the owner of the railroads, and he is making Uncle Sam carry it. So it says land grants were sold to businesses instead of settlers. They also were sold at fixed prices, and they did not offer consistent pricing. Some charged more than others. It says that shorter hauls cost more because railroads were the only option. So it was kind of like it became a monopoly, and we'll discuss what a monopoly is a little bit later. Okay, so if you look in this picture here, this is a farmer, and this is a railroad, all right, and it's wrapped around Congress, okay, kind of looks like a big snake here, and it looks like it's trying to constrict Congress, and again, the farmers here are trying to kill it, basically. So Grangers convinced state legislatures to pass laws that established a maximum freight and passenger fees that prohibited discrimination. The U.S. Supreme Court upheld these Granger laws, and in 1876 the Farmers Alliance was founded. They wanted to help farmers get out of poverty and help end the cropland system. Most farmers could not make a decent living and struggled, and beginning in 1877, State governments regulated the railroads, which set a precedent, okay, that the federal government could regulate private businesses to protect public interest. So again, we actually just discussed this a while back in my American government class. So the federal government got involved, and they determined that the railroad could technically be under the federal government's control, and they were allowed to regulate it. Now, unfortunately, at some point, the farmers lose. In 1886, Wabash, St. Louis, and the Pacific Railway Company versus Illinois, this was a Supreme Court case. In this case, the Supreme Court ruled that a state could not set rates in interstate commerce, that only the federal government could. This is one of these things that the federal government determined that the federal government was the only group that had control over the railroads, and therefore they were the only ones who could set rates for interstate commerce. In 1887, Congress passed the Interstate Commerce Act. The federal government gave the right to supervise railroad activities and created the Interstate Commerce Commission to keep watch over how everything worked. Even though the ICC was formed, it struggled to regulate rates. The populace. So, People's Party, or the Populists, this is an example of another political party, was formed in 1891. Their goal was they wanted to weaken large businesses and banks so the agrarian industry could prosper. Now, agrarian, keep in mind, that's farming. So they wanted to weaken the large businesses so that the farmers could make a comeback. But in 1892, the presidential candidate that was nominated by the Populists lost. In 1897, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that the ICC could not set maximum railroad rates. Now we get to monopolies. So, businesses and a few individuals saw their wealth increase dramatically. Most successful businesses were usually monopolies. A monopoly controls the prices, production, and sales of goods in its area of specialization. They can eventually eliminate the competition. So if you've ever played the board game Monopoly, what's the goal of the board game? The goal is you want to buy up as much property as you can. That way whoever lands on your property has to pay you. And that's the same idea with a monopoly. If you own the factories, if you own the means of production, then you are you're the only person that they can come to, so you're making all the money. A lot of people have compared Disney to a monopoly, and they said that they've become very powerful. Vertical integration. So what happened is, and this is part of capitalism, businesses produce raw materials or owns other businesses that produce raw materials. Then the businesses manufactures the product, and then the business market, they enter the business market and they sell the finished product. Now, with horizontal integration, keep in mind horizon, that means flat. Businesses acquire other businesses that produce the same product. So this is an example of monopolies, okay? Monopolies are not a great thing, okay? Capitalism is supposed to work this way. That means they would now use their stuff and depend on other businesses. Monopolies control the whole thing. Enter Andrew Carnegie. So Carnegie Steel Company. He used what was known as the Bessemer process, along with vertical integration and horizontal integration. For example, at the top you have the Carnegie Steel Plant in Pennsylvania. So he bought the iron mines, he also bought the railroad companies, and he owned the steel mill. So that means he was making money off of all three things, okay? Another thing that he did, he merged with other steel companies, so he controlled it from the top and the bottom. He controlled the raw materials, the transportation, and other steel companies. He controlled mostly all of the steel industry, which left no competition. In economics, when you get to your senior year, you may take me or Coach Skelton for economics, and we talk about competition, supply and demand. Competition is very important because it keeps the prices low. for the buyer. If you have a monopoly, that means one person or one company controls everything, and they're the ones who set the prices, and they cannot be disputed. Okay? Competition is good because, like I said, it means a lower price for the consumer, whoever you are, whatever you're buying. J.P. Morgan, another. In 1901, Morgan's business, United States Steel, bought Carnegie Steel Company, and therefore they merged their businesses. At this point, they became the largest business in the world, aka a monopoly. Now we have John D. Rockefeller. Rockefeller was known for owning Standard Oil Company. In 1879, it controlled 90% of U.S. oil refining businesses. It also sold byproducts of petroleum, paraffin, and candle makers. It sold asphalt to paving companies. It sold petroleum jelly to medical facilities. It also bought horses and wagons, and they built a pipeline. And he even bought forest land. He bought other oil refineries combined into Standard Oil Trust, and he used this trust agreement, which means no competition, and it created a monopoly. So he was making money off of all of this. He was very, very filthy rich. So this is why monopolies are bad. Okay? Monopolies are harmful for consumers because what happens is the consumer ends up paying a very, very high price for stuff that probably shouldn't cost that much. It's also harmful for small businesses because they just can't compete. In 1890, Congress passed the Sherman Antitrust Act, and this was supposed to outlaw monopolies. These are just some political cartoons. We'll skip through that. Okay. The federal government was given the authority to dissolve the trust, or aka monopolies. Anyone participating would be fined or sent to jail. And then individuals and businesses could sue for up to triple the damages. However, the act did not define important terms. In another Supreme Court case in 1895, the United States versus the E.C. Knight Company, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that American Sugar Refining Company did not control sugar refining industry, even though it controlled 98% of all sugar refining in the United States. So how did that happen? I don't know. Depression strikes. So what happens is you have many railroad businesses who closed or went bankrupt. You have mismanagement of funds, overbuilding, competition, and corruption. In the Panic of 1873, J. Cook and Company declared bankruptcy, and they began the first depression caused by industrial capitalism. This lasted until March of 1879, and it was felt throughout the world. Many businesses failed, and unemployment increased. Okay? I want to say that's Uncle Sam. I can't remember. I can't see the picture hardly. You do have to... no, I don't think I made you do that one. I was going to make you look at this political cartoon, but I changed my mind. All right. So, Panic of 1893. In 1893, two of the largest U.S. companies in the United States, Philadelphia and Reading and the National Cordage Company, failed. It means they went bankrupt. This lasted until 1897. So that means when a big company like that goes bankrupt, if you've been paying attention to the news over the past, 10 years, a lot of these big retail stores are going bankrupt. And that means that you have a lot of layoffs and a lot of people who lose their job. And what happens is then you have a very large amount of unemployment, and that is very bad. So 600 banks and 15,000 businesses closed or went bankrupt, and 4 million people lost their jobs by 1895. Bad. That's a lot of people who were out of work. Now, social Darwinism. This is a lot to explain right now. I know this is very detailed. I'm so sorry. It's a lot of content to cover in a semester. So, in this idea of social Darwinism, this is based off the theory of evolution by Charles Darwin, who is this guy right here. I think we've all heard of evolution, right? This is this idea that people evolved. Typically, they try to say that humans evolved from monkeys, but they evolve to adapt to their surroundings. And basically, another theory that he had is that only the strong survive. So Americans question how some became so wealthy. Luck? Education? Did they work hard? Were there special skills or talents? Economists use social Darwinism to explain it. They said that those who had the necessary skills to be successful, such as talent, intelligence, or work ethic, would do well, and those who lacked these skills would not. The marketplace should not be regulated by the government. This idea of laissez-faire economics, this is what we talk about in my econ class. It is this idea that you leave the market alone, that what will be, and that the government should not be involved. They also did not support government assistance, safety regulations, or laws restricting child labor. Again, they decided that only the fittest should survive, which, I mean, I don't support children working at 5 years old in a factory, but, we'll talk about that. They also supported racism, so, not great. Also, keep in mind, though, let's just say this. Just because you have this group who has some pretty bad ideas doesn't mean that all of their ideas are bad, okay? You can take things and apply it in different ways. Oh, okay. The gospel of wealth. What happened during this time is there became a very large gap between the people who were considered wealthy and the people who were poor. In 1889, Andrew Carnegie, which we talked about him, wrote an article called The Gospel of Wealth. He said that people who were successful were the ones who possessed the necessary skills. So again, that's the idea of social Darwinism. He also said that God decided who would have those skills. The wealthy had a responsibility to share their wealth with those who were not. And these were people who were known as philanthropists. So philanthropists are basically anybody who donates. They gave a lot of their money away to charities. Also, wealthy citizens who donated large amounts of money. Oh, that's what we said. Anyway, they donate a large amount of money to improve society. So here's what Carnegie did. Carnegie used his money to improve educational opportunities for everybody. He founded over 3,000 libraries, because I told you that one of the key elements to success is learning how to read and education. He also gave millions to universities in his homeland of Scotland and America. Then he created the Carnegie Mellon University, and there is Carnegie Hall, which is named after him. He gave almost 90% of his wealth to charitable causes. Rockefeller, on the other hand, he also donated money. He gave it to churches, medical facilities, universities, art centers. He also helped found the University of Chicago. This was the first biomedical institute in the United States. And we have the Rockefeller Medical Research Institute, which created vaccines for meningitis and the yellow fever, which were pretty common back in that time. And they would kill a lot of people, so that he actually put his money to good use to research vaccines for new medicines. Now, you have an activity that we'll do with this. Robber baron. You have the philanthropists, or the captains of industry, and the robber barons. A robber baron is someone who was the negative. They became wealthy because they exploited workers and natural resources by receiving preferential government treatment. Rockefeller and Carnegie saw huge profits, but they paid their employees low wages. They drove out all their competition by selling their product at a cheaper price. And when they controlled the industry, they hiked the prices up. So they were actually stealing. Not really, but they were, because they were treating these people pretty poorly. Cornelius Vanderbilt. Probably heard of Vanderbilt. He earned millions, and he did not make a significant charitable contribution until 1873. which you've heard of, Vanderbilt University. He left the rest of his fortune, over $100 million, to his son. Oh, okay. Jay Gould, he was one of the greediest of the robber barons. He and Vanderbilt were actually competitors, which means they used to try to work against each other. He actually used illegal tactics. He tried to bribe the New York government to keep Vanderbilt from gaining control of the Erie Railway Company. Bribing is illegal. He also built a railroad empire at the expense of others. He did not pay his railroad workers a livable wage or even provide them a safe work environment. And he never donated a significant amount of his wealth to charitable causes. And when he died, he left his $72 million to his children. Now we get into some of the inventions that were created during the Gilded Age. You have Thomas Edison, who created the light bulb in 1879. Edison also created a system for producing and distributing electric power. That way that businesses and factories could be built anywhere and operate even when things were dark. Light bulbs were then started to used in homes and on streets. Think about like street lamps, for example. Samuel Morse created the telegraph in 1832. What this did was it sent wired messages or Morse code using dashes and dots for letters. And then you have Alexander Graham Bell, who created the telephone. This transmitted voices over electric wires. So this was huge. Again, this means that now you've got more communication. You've got faster trade. So this means that you'll see start to see a large boom in production. On the other hand, you've got labor unions. Okay. So, unskilled workers, think of immigrants and other people who were just poor, earned very low wages. They had long work days. They were not given vacation time. And a lot of these people worked in very unsafe environments. There's an examples of factories that actually burned down, and a lot of people died in the factory fires because they were not able to get out. Most family members had to work to survive. So that means that if you have bigger families, children as young as 5 would have to go to work in factories. Another thing is that laborers were not reimbursed for injuries suffered on a job. So let's say if you got your hand caught in one of these factory machines, they would just cut your hand off, okay? Or if you got sick and, something happened, they would not pay you for that. There was no sick pay. Factories were not well ventilated, and a lot of these people breathed in dirty air. And an average of 675 laborers were killed in work-related accidents every week in 1882. That's a lot of people. This is an example of a sweatshop in a Ludlow Street tenement house in New York City. Sweatshops, you've probably heard of it, is where you have very, very cheap labor, usually making some sort of clothing item. Sweatshops still happen today over in countries like China. You need to look into this because things like, Beyonce's line, Air Jordans, things like that are actually produced in sweatshops. Okay. Labor unions. Laborers began to demand higher pay and safer working conditions. So they decided to form unions, which, you've always heard that you have more influence as a group than you do as an individual. So if you have more people who are shouting something, your voice is more likely to be heard. They also started to join craft unions where they basically got together with people who held the same job. So one of the things, like, for example, a lot of teachers are involved and are members of a teacher union. And that's because they are all teachers, and they do that to protect their jobs. However, some unions discriminated against women, African Americans, and immigrants. And the way that the labor unions were able to get what they wanted was called collective bargaining. And that is where the group of workers negotiated with the employer through the union, but they also used strikes, protests, boycotts, and even sabotage. strikes. That's where laborers refused to work, so businesses would actually end up losing money. Most strikes, however, were not successful because if you think about it, there's a lot of people who wanted a job. And if you have a lot of people who want a job and you go on strike, it's very easy to get more people to come work. They also tried to get people to boycott. You've probably heard of a boycott. That is when you try to get people not to buy certain products. That way businesses would lose money. Boycotts were most successful in small towns. They were not as successful in large towns. You also have sabotage, which is technically illegal, but some laborers tried to do it anyway. It's like they would actually go out of their way to try to do things to hurt a business and try to get it closed down. This is an example of federal troops protecting the Rock Island Railroad from striking workers in 1894. All right, next we'll talk about the Great Upheaval. So in 1877, you had a series of protests and strikes in the United States. Baltimore and the Ohio Railroad Company actually cut laborers' wages 3 times in 1 year, and that really upset the workers. So what they did is they actually blocked all the engines, that way they could not leave. And they refused to allow any train to leave until the pay was restored. Townspeople and most police supported the laborers because these were people living in the towns, and they did not, support the big businesses. However, because the police did not put a stop to it, they sent in the federal troops, which is the National Guard, and they ended the strike. The laborers actually sabotaged trains. Only one made it to its destination, so that means they actually physically damaged the train. That way it could not make it to its destination. So what happens after this is that news spread and more strikes began to happen, and the Great Upheaval lasted around a month. Over 100,000 laborers went on strike, and over 100 were killed. About 1,000 were actually thrown in jail. Millions of dollars in damage were done to the railroad industry. If you look at this picture here to the right, it shows the devastation of railroad equipment, cars, and locomotives during the railroad riots. And again, these people were trying to riot for better wages. So this is all pieces of the train that they tore up. Okay. Now businesses, they actually started to fight back. I know this is a lot on this slide, so if I go too fast, just pause. So businesses tried to prevent unions from forming, and sometimes they would actually use violence. They actually tried to persuade judges to rule against the unions, and they even got the federal troops involved. They created what was known as a lockout, which means that they told employees not to come to work until they could agree with the owner's terms. If an owner had a surplus of goods, he could still make money. One of the things you'll need to know about are yellow dog contracts. Employees were forced to sign to promise that they would never join a union. You also had strike breakers who were hired to take the place of striking workers. So that means, like I said, if somebody went on strike, they had more people to come in and replace them. Strike breakers were also called scabs because they were kind of looked at as like, not really like a snitch, but you know what I mean? Somebody who is making, they're benefiting off somebody else's problems. They faced violence from striking workers. It's called crossing the picket line. So the striking workers would actually be out in the front of the business, and they would have a picket line with fences and things like that. And so the scabs who were trying to go to work to make money could possibly get hurt from the workers who were striking in the front. Another thing is they would blacklist. So owners would share names of laborers who joined the union, and they would try to make an effort not to hire that person. So we have the National Labor Union, 1886. Smaller unions joined together to form the National Labor Union, and members were skilled and unskilled workers. But unfortunately, they discriminated against African Americans. They fought for higher wages, shorter work days, and they also influenced politics. They supported equal pay for women and men doing the same job. They also supported laws to keep public lands from being purchased by speculators, raising farm prices so farmers could make a higher wage, and they pushed to end prison labor. However, they were eventually disbanded. Now you have the African American Women's Unions. So in 1869, you have the Colored National Labor Union. It disbanded and many members joined the Knights of Labor. In 1903, Mary Harris Jones led 80 children, many with horrible injuries from work-related accidents, and they actually marched to President Roosevelt's home to try to protest. Okay, the Knights of Labor, another major labor union. It was a secret organization. Members were unskilled and skilled workers. They accepted African Americans and women. They were against capitalism. They were actually more for socialism. They believed class was more important than race or gender. In 1879, it was not secret anymore, and it was one of the first unions to organize strikes. So the Knights of Labor supported limited immigration, restricting child labor, an 8-hour workday, equal pay for men and women doing the same job. They also didn't want railroads or communication systems to be owned by private businesses. They felt it should be owned by the government, which again is why they were labeled as socialists. They became one of the largest labor unions in the United States, and in 1886, membership declined because of the deadly Haymarket riot, which you will have to read about in one of your activities. The public began to associate unions with violence and anarchy, and that was not a good thing. Anarchy means lack of government. And all of these people, they just wanted to go to work and pay and work and, feed their families. They weren't trying to get involved in any of this. So eventually the Knights of Labor disbanded. You've also got the American Federation of Labor. In 1886, the AFL was founded by leaders of craft unions. Remember, we said that craft unions were people who had a similar career, a similar job. So like a bunch of teachers. They believed in capitalism. They also believed that only skilled laborers could be members, and they were organized by craft. The main focus was higher wages and safer working conditions. They kept members united. They preferred collective bargaining, but did strike or use boycotts when necessary. They actually won shorter work weeks and better wages. And the head of the American Federation of Labor was Samuel Gompers, and he is sitting here in his office. All right, socialist unions. They actually wanted to end capitalism. At some point in this class, we'll talk about the difference between socialism and capitalism. So they wanted the government to own all the industries and divide profits among those who created the goods. They did not agree with how most Americans worked hard to have little, while a few had incredible wealth. No one would have wealth without laborers, is what they believed. Okay, you have the American Railway Union, founded by Eugene V. Debs. It wasn't originally socialist, but then Debs later formed the Socialist Party in 1901, but it never gained significant political power. Okay, and last slide, Industrial Workers of the World. In 1905, the Industrial Workers of the World, aka the Wobblies, were formed. They refused to negotiate with owners. They called for strikes and boycotts. They lost more than they won, but they let the public know that laborers were mistreated. So they actually, did some good. Okay? And so that is the end of this section.